Hey there, this is Pat Ennis of Ennis Legacy Partners. Welcome to the Exit Readiness podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Walter Dial, who is tax partner at GRF CPAs and Advisors in Bethesda, Maryland. Our mission here on the podcast is to provide you, the business owner, with subject matter expertise on topics pertaining to building sellable or transferable business value and for planning your eventual exit from the business. We want to help you build a business that's sellable and then exit successfully on your own terms and conditions. In our last episode, we discussed the importance of having a plan for business continuity if you're a sole owner of a business. Today, we want to focus on owners of multiple owner businesses, or partners, if you will, with some planning tips regarding what is arguably the most impactful business planning document that you would have, your buy-sell agreement.
Yeah, that's definitely correct, Pat. A buy-sell agreement is just one of the really critical documents that need to be put into place as soon as a business is formed. And it's, I don't know if I would say surprising, but it's kind of interesting that, you and I have both been involved in a number of situations where an unexpected event happens in the business, and our first response is, well, how is it addressed in your buy-sell agreement? And the response is, we never did a buy-sell agreement.
Or we haven't looked at it in 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. So, the general idea behind the buy-sell agreement is that you're trying to anticipate things that could happen in the business that you kind of hope won't, but they could. And if you don't address it ahead of time, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're trying to address these issues either in the heat of a very emotional time, a very scary time, a very bad time for the business. There's lots of different scenarios where you really don't want to have to be trying to figure something out from scratch. You want to have it already in place. So let me give you a few examples. And we're talking about situations like the death or permanent disability of one of the owners. I've had situations where a couple of women form a business and, they're fairly young. They plan on growing this business for the next 30 years. And after 5 years, one of them decides, I'm getting a little burned out. I think I want to do something else with my life. That can happen. A person can just decide voluntarily, hey, I just don't want to be in the business anymore. And then, of course, you can have other things happen. You can have a partner go through a divorce or a bankruptcy, which can have serious implications on the business. And you want to make sure that you've addressed all of these potential situations ahead of time. So let me give an example of how a buy-sell agreement can work. Let's just make up a company, ACME Digital Marketing. And let's just say it's owned by 4 founding partners, Sarah, John, Jim, and Susan. And they started their business about 20 years ago. They did put a buy-sell agreement in place, and they've been very diligent in reviewing it every year, because this is a document, as we'll discuss a little later, that needs to be consistently and constantly reviewed and possibly updated. So Sarah decides she wants to leave the business and retire at the end of 2020. Now, this is somewhat unexpected. They had thought that, Sarah would continue on for a few more years, but she decides she wants to leave. So all the current conversations regarding Sarah's wish to leave are actually going very smoothly. The reason for this is that they have a buy-sell agreement that clearly outlines what happens when one of the owners decides to leave. And it includes things like how is the business to be valued and what are the terms of the payout. So that's a situation that's going to go very well because they have a buy-sell agreement in place. Think what would happen if they didn't. And Sarah shows up and says, hey guys, I've decided I don't want to work here anymore. All of a sudden she says, I'd like to be paid out for my share of the business. They have no agreement in place that's going to define what that means. They have no idea what she's entitled to. She has no idea what she's entitled to. I mean, you can very easily see a situation like this end up in court. So it could be a really bad situation. Let's take another example with the same business. Let's say that 2 years ago, Jim suddenly died of a heart attack. And there was, fortunately, again, we had the buy-sell agreement in place, including a stock redemption plan, and the funding went very smoothly. Why? Because the buy-sell agreement explained in detail exactly what happens upon the death of one of the owners. So you can see where this is another situation where, just think of the emotion involved. One of the owners unexpectedly dies. The last thing on people's mind is going to be valuing the business and all these other administrative things. They're going to be in a period of mourning, and there's going to be other, larger issues just affecting the business when one of the owners dies. So if a buy-sell agreement is in place, as horrible as this situation is, at least the financial side of it is all spelled out ahead of time and can be handled according to the buy-sell agreement. So as you can see from the examples, the purpose of the buy-sell agreement is an attempt to address all the different events that can trigger a transfer of ownership. And as we've discussed, the primary benefit of having the agreement in place is to avoid having to make decisions that could lead to some serious disagreements at a really horrible time for the business.
Yeah, so that's that last illustration in particular with Jim and how the buy-sell agreement worked at his death. That, as we both know, that's how it's supposed to work, Walter. But as we also both know, all too often it doesn't happen that way, even if the owners had a buy-sell agreement in place. Sometimes having a buy-sell agreement in place, if they haven't looked at it in 20 years or it hasn't been updated, can actually cause more problems than not having one.
Yeah, that's why I love it when you meet with a client and you ask them, you kind of go through the list of agreements they should have in place, and you don't let them get away with just saying, yes, we have one. You always say, and when's the last time you looked at it?
Yeah, well, that's right. And so ideally it's kept, and we encourage people to look at it once a year. But really, I mean, if they look at it every 2 years, that would be phenomenal. That'd be fantastic. And here are some of the questions that should be addressed in the document. You've mentioned some of them in your example there. Are lifetime triggering events addressed, as well as death and disability? We see death and disability addressed almost always. But these lifetime events, such as divorce, such as bankruptcy, voluntary exits, like you just mentioned a few minutes ago, they're often not addressed, or if they are, not adequately. And then this is in line with what you do with valuations. What type of valuation estimate is required? Book value, fair market value, fair value, investment value, agreed upon value. We know of a situation, a couple of owners in business for 20 years. They had a buy-sell agreement in place. They didn't look at it for 20 years or for a long time. One wanted to leave, and it stated book value. Well, the business had a ton of goodwill in it and other assets in it. And so there was conflict and need for reconciliation and a whole 9 yards because the right valuation method was not outlined in the agreement. And then what is the desired timing for the value calculation? Is it going to be the date of the trigger event? Trigger event being, death, disability, a lifetime event. Does the entire business need to be valued, or a partial ownership interest? Should the buy-sell agreement method of funding be taken into consideration in the value? For example, if the funding method is going to be a loan, financing in some way, should that be considered, and how that piece of the business is going to be evaluated? Because you got to service the debt on the loan. And so that decreases the cash flow and so on and so forth. Should the buy-sell agreement funding, what method should be used for the valuation? Fixed price, formal valuation, formula-based? Is there clarity as to what is mandatory and what is optional regarding purchase or sale of an ownership interest? In other words, if you and I own the business and I die, is it optional for you to buy my shares from my estate, or is it mandatory? That often is not clarified the way it needs to be. What goals for your spouse and family do you want to be realized if you exit unexpectedly? You should determine if there's a financial gap between the financial resources available to you as an owner at your death that would be available to your spouse and your family at your death, and what they're going to need. And just make sure you've done a financial needs analysis and a financial gap analysis. And then where does the business and the value of the business need to fit into that if you were to die unexpectedly or to become disabled? And if the value of the buyout's not enough to generate required income to attain those goals, there may be a need, and there often is, a need for additional life insurance and or what we would call a wage continuation plan.
Yeah. And Pat, a lot of your points kind of centered around valuation. And I would say, I think you'd probably agree, that's really the most contentious part of a buy-sell agreement. And it's interesting because usually when they set the agreement up, it's not a big deal. They just kind of, maybe the lawyer puts whatever his normal boilerplate wording is regarding valuation, and they kind of skim over it, because a lot of times it's kind of like estate planning. You just assume none of this bad stuff's ever going to happen. So you don't really focus on it that much. But then all of a sudden you're relying on the agreement when one of these situations does arise, and maybe the methodology for the valuation is really not what you anticipated, and it's really going to cause a problem. I can give you a couple examples. We had a client who was really interesting. The two of them, it was two men owned it, and it was way back in the late 80s. It was an IT company, and it really took off. But the two of them they really could never stand each other to begin with. And I think when they were struggling to make it work for whatever reason, the dynamics were okay. Once they became successful, the dynamics between the two of them kind of fell apart. And they had a very fortunately, they had anticipated this. And almost to the extent that you kind of think they kind of knew that they really didn't like each other, because they actually had a provision in their buy-sell agreement that said, if one of them wants to leave and he comes to the other one and says, I want you to buy me out at X, the person that he made that offer to had the right to flip it around on them. So for instance, let's say you and I were in a business together, Pat, and I just got sick of you, which of course could never happen. And I come in and I say, okay, I want you, and I'm just, I just want a lot of money. So I come in and say, okay, I want you to buy me out for $5 million, knowing that the business is worth $1 million. You would have the right to say, okay, let's flip it around. You're going to buy me out for $5 million. So it's kind of a way to prevent one person from going crazy, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, that's actually called the Texas shootout provision.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. But I mean, the more common problems you see is really, and not to beat up attorneys, but when it comes to valuation terms, they have very specific meanings. They're not interchangeable. So book value has a different meaning than fair market value. Intrinsic value has a different meaning than investment value. So if you just throw these terms around, you can really find yourself having a problem. So there's a trade-off, because you don't necessarily want to make the agreement complicated, and you don't want to incur a whole lot of valuation fees. So there's a kind of a tug of war between keeping the agreement simple and yet getting the results that you want. So I've seen a number of agreements, especially in professional service firms, which is a large part of my practice, where the value of the business is just set at book value. And it's almost as if the company really has no book value, even though, as you've discussed, clearly it would. They would have goodwill and things like that. And instead, the buyout is really based on the compensation that the owner has been earning over a period of maybe 3 or 5 previous years. So that takes the valuation equation kind of almost completely out of it, which really makes the agreement simple. And like I said, that works pretty well in a cash basis professional service company. It won't work in a lot of other situations. So then you get to a little more complicated, where you'll have a situation where maybe the company is going to be valued based on fair market value. And fair market value is the methodology that's used in anytime you're doing anything before the IRS. So a lot of people feel comfortable using fair market value because they know the IRS isn't going to come in and challenge anything they've done. One of the interesting issues with fair market value is when you use fair market value as your standard, that means if someone owns less than a controlling interest in the company, that value is going to be discounted. So for instance, let's say I own 40% of a company and you own 60. I decide to walk away. I'm going to have to take a hit on the valuation of my 40%, probably a 15 to 20% discount. And yet once you get my shares, you're going to own 100%. So you're never going to realize that discount. So I'm really kind of getting hosed in that situation. So I have seen agreements that say fair market value without discounts, and that type of thing. But it just kind of highlights that it's important to get an understanding of how valuation works on day one, so you can make your agreement the best. And you really can't rely on your attorney to do this. I mean, sometimes if you have an attorney who specializes in this area, he's going to really have it down. But I'm sure you've seen this, Pat. We have a number of clients who have the family friend or whoever who's their attorney, and he may be great in some areas, but he's not that familiar with buy-sell, so he just kind of throws one together. That can be very, very risky. There's other ways to value companies. There's fair value, which also has a very specific valuation. That's tend to be used more in asset valuations. Then you have investment or strategic value, and that's one where you take a look at. It's kind of the most you could ever get for a company. So maybe you're selling it to a competitor who can fold you into their operations and really leverage your business, that type of thing. But what we usually see is fair market value. And like I said, sometimes it's fair market value without a discount. The other thing that comes into play in valuation is maybe you don't just want to get one value. So I've seen agreements, I'm sure you have too, Pat, where it'll call for two valuations. And if they're within 10% of each other, you just average them. If they're not within 10% of each other, you get a third valuation, and that's the one that controls. So, you think about the cost you're incurring in that situation, potentially three valuations at, could be $10,000 each. So, there's lots of different things, as we've talked about, to consider when you're defining how the company is going to be valued. So we need to decide, what's the standard of value, and it's the standard of value, and if you're going to make any adjustments to that value, to kind of customize it for your particular business. Another thing I really like to do early on is kind of model it. So say, okay, well, if we go with this valuation and this is what the company looks like 10 years from now, this is what you're looking at. And we can even do a couple, what if scenarios to kind of show how that's going to work. Because once you have numbers in place, and I've even seen examples embedded in agreements, just because it really clarifies and it shows that everybody agreed to this. Once you actually have the numbers on paper, it really shows the owners exactly what they're looking at. And I think it makes it a lot easier to make a decision.
Yeah, so one of the points you made right at the outset there, Walter, was that this can be is probably the most common point of contention when it comes to buy-sell agreements. And boy, that's so true. And you can just see where it could be from just your brief summary there of valuation methods, because it's more. There's more to the decision than what a lot of people think, and so it's true. I mean, it is the most common point of contention when it comes to executing a document or an agreement that's actually in place. And then another point you made was about you used the example of an attorney who may be more of a general practitioner who ends up doing a buy-sell agreement for someone, and how that may not be the wisest decision if you're the business owner. That can apply too, right, to exit planners, to CPAs, to insurance people, across the board. What you want is professionals on your team who absolutely work in this area. It's what they do. It's their focus. It's their practice area. It's their expertise. We had the privilege of working with a company out west recently, 2 partners, and leading the team of professionals needed to create their buy-sell agreement. They'd been in business for quite some time, and they didn't have a buy-sell agreement in place. Well, it took about 8 months to get it done, just the buy-sell agreement, because the valuation had to be negotiated, timing had to be negotiated, a lot of things had to be negotiated. Their estate planners, estate planning attorneys had to get involved. So too often, that kind of detailed attention is not given to these agreements, and that's when they can end up causing more problems than they solve at the end of the day. Yeah, so great job on that. Other related questions here pertaining to buy-sell agreements related to valuation would be, again, what's the effective date of the valuation? You mentioned something along the lines of, will the entire company need to be valuated or just a partial ownership interest? And then how will the valuation be determined? A fixed price, formula-based computation, a formal valuation by a certified valuation specialist like you, like yourself. Another key question is whether or not the buy-sell agreement will be funded. And if so, how? For example, in a business with 2 owners, if one dies and the agreement is that the surviving partner would purchase the deceased owner's interest from their estate, where are the funds going to come from? Too often, buy-sell agreements, they're drafted, maybe they're drafted perfectly along the lines of what we've been talking about here, but it's come up short in regard to funding. Where's the money actually going to come from for the actual transaction? So that needs to be,
for sure.
That needs to be considered as well. And usually, what you're going to need there is you're going to need some input from an insurance professional who's very experienced in advanced planning. Advanced planning being this level planning around buy-sell agreements, stock redemption plans, cross purchase, hybrid plans, their experience with deferred compensation, that kind of insurance planning.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Pat. And we've had I forget the gentleman's name, but we've had guests to discuss the funding of these agreements. That's probably something we should do again next year as we're mapping out our schedule.
Yeah.
So in closing, let's provide some recommended next steps to our listeners. And the first one's obvious. If you have business partners and you don't have a buy-sell agreement in place, make it a priority for 2021 to have one drafted. And if you do have one in place and you haven't reviewed it in the last year or year and a half, please go back and review it in light of the questions that we've presented here in the podcast. And just put it on your calendar to review it every year as part of your strategic planning for the business.
Yeah, and then two, to Walter's earlier point, decide on the needed advisors for a meaningful and impactful document. One that's not going to cause more problems for you than it's going to solve. And so decide, who do we need on our team? Do we need our CPA involved? Probably yes, because there's taxation issues. We need a valuation specialist. Yes, probably. And like in Walter's case, that might be the same person. You're going to need an attorney to draft the document. And then we have found that it's very helpful that each partner has their own legal representation, particularly as it pertains to estate planning, because there are some, excuse me, some estate planning considerations that need to be brought into view. And so representation for each partner on that level. And then maybe the corporate business attorney actually drafts the document. So the estate planning attorneys with the owners have input regarding their own personal interests that need to be reflected into that document. And then the business attorney actually drafts and makes sure it's all in there. But the CPA needs to weigh in on tax issues, the valuation specialist, and then too, the advanced planning insurance specialist needs to be brought to bear regarding, is it going to be cross purchase versus stock redemption? And then what type of insurance contracts are going to be most, is it going to be term insurance, permanent? Most situations, it's going to be term. And then an insurance piece that's often overlooked is the disability buyout coverage, which your advanced planning insurance professional can help you with as well. And we
Pat,
yeah.
Let me ask you a question. So I'm putting myself in the shoes of our listeners, and what you just talked about is a lot of professionals.
Yeah.
And every area you mentioned is something a normal business owner is not going to be real savvy about. So I know you recently were was it like a 3-month engagement or something? Just talk for a second about how you were able to assist the business owner, because you basically my understanding is you coordinated the whole thing and kind of presented the owner, you kind of winnowed down the information to the important points that the owner needs. How does that really work?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. Well, it actually turned out to be much longer than 3 months. And basically, it became clear real quick that these professionals were needed. The way I just described a few minutes ago, but someone had to lead the team, almost like a project manager, like we do with exit planning. There needed to be a project manager or general contractor, however you want to title the role, to just lead the project with milestones and make sure that the other professionals are communicating with each other the way they need to. And so, yeah, it's true. And the other thing about it is, if you're the business owner listening to this podcast and this piece of it, you're going to be thinking, oh my gosh, cha-ching, 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 right? I got to pay Walter Dial and Ennis and all these attorneys. Well, yeah, if you're going to have it done right, it's going to be an investment, but the investment you're going to make is going to be fractional compared to, or minimal compared to what's at stake and what's at risk if you don't get it done right. Because not only is
I think that the fees that come your way, in a way, I really think you pay for yourself in the process, kind of like a general contractor, like you said, because you're going to be able to make sure that the other professionals are staying in their lane. They're not running up hours doing things you haven't specifically asked them to do. Mm-hmm. You're going to be able to streamline meetings. I think at the end of the day, you're going to more than pay for yourself with the contribution that you make to the process.
Yeah, well, thank you. That I think we do, absolutely, because of the reasons that you just clarified there. It really streamlined, because we understand. We know how to talk to each one of those professionals, and we know what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. And so someone's got to lead it. It's either going to be the owner or it's going to be one of those professionals who they really don't want to usually. They want to stay in their lane. They want to do the tax work, or they want to do the valuation work. They want to do the lead work. They don't want to lead the whole thing usually. But someone's got to do it, or the fees are going to get out of control, and it's just going to take crazy amount of time. So, it sounds like a lot, and it's not insignificant. However, what's at stake is extremely significant because it's not just the financial piece that's at stake downstream, it's relationships. We know of people who are still not reconciled because this wasn't done right. So clearly we're going to advise to make an investment up front so that it doesn't cost you not just a bunch of money, but relationships downstream. So anyway, I think we're running out of time here today, Walter. You want to close us up here?
Yeah, certainly. So, as always, listeners, if you want help with creating or reviewing your buy-sell agreement and maximizing the value of your business or planning for your eventual exit, you can reach Pat at 301-859-0860, and you can reach me at 301-951-9090. You can also access resources at ExitReadiness.com, grfcpa.com, and nslp.com. As always, thanks for listening. And if you've benefited from listening, please consider sharing the podcast on social media. I hope everybody has a fantastic Thanksgiving. And until next time on the Exit Readiness Podcast, this is Walter Dial and Pat Ennis signing off.